Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me. My name is Aaron Hutchinson, and I am the Education Training Director for the ADHD Foundation. I'm really pleased that you can join this pre-recorded presentation all about supporting your child's education, learning and well-being, looking at it through the lens of ADHD. What are some of the difficulties that they might come up against, and what can we do to support them to achieve their best outcomes? So just to begin with, I just wanted to start by talking about some of the positives about ADHD, because they often don't get spoken about. We often focus on the negatives and on what the areas that they may be having difficulty with, but I just wanted to start by thinking about these things. So one of the presentations of ADHD is impulsivity. Now, obviously, this can cause a few difficulties, and we're going to discuss that as we go through. But we can also reframe that and think of someone who is impulsive as, yes, they do sometimes have difficulty thinking before they speak, thinking before they act, but actually that makes them really spontaneous, and it makes them really quick thinking, so they're able to adapt quickly and think quickly on their feet. Someone who's hyperactive, we could see that as someone who's really energetic or really enthusiastic. And we know, particularly with ADHD, children, young people, adults with the condition can often do something called hyperfocus, which essentially means being able to pay attention to something for a really long period of time if they are engaged in it and if they are interested, which is the key message that I'm going to put forward in this presentation. Then we've got things like problem solving skills, creative thinking, and just general insightfulness as well. Now, obviously everyone presents differently, but these are some of those positives that are often associated with ADHD. Now, what is ADHD? Well, it's a neurodevelopmental condition. So it's to do with our brains, and there's three main presentations in terms of getting a diagnosis, which we look at things like inattention, so difficulties in paying attention to the right thing. It's not necessarily difficulties in paying attention, it's sometimes being able to block out what's not important and focus on what is important. We've got impulsivity, which I've already mentioned, and that thinking before you speak, thinking before you act. We've got hyperactivity as well, so being always on the go all the time, needing things to do, having a very busy mind, and it can lead to some fidgetiness or restlessness. But we can also have verbal hyperactivity as well, so excessive talk, and also internal hyperactivity, so lots of thoughts racing through your head. It affects something called our executive functions, which is essentially the way that our brain plans and organizes for us, and one of those things is a working memory, which I'm going to come back to in a little bit. And it also affects our ability to regulate our emotions as well, which is why we often see children with ADHD, some of them having a little bit of a difficult time controlling their emotions, regulating their emotions, and perhaps sometimes responding in a way that might seem appropriate to those without ADHD. So we're going to explore that as well. Now, in terms of what ADHD stands for, if you've seen my colleague Emma Weaver's recorded presentation, you'll know that she'll have spoken about this as well. It stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Now, when we look at this, firstly, I think this seems quite negative, really. And when we think about that word disorder, it implies that there's something wrong with you, when actually we at the ADHD Foundation, we don't see the condition as a disorder, and we don't think there's anything wrong with having ADHD. We just see it as a difference. It just means that your brain operates or functions slightly differently to those without ADHD. And this first bit, attention deficit, I think that sort of implies that you don't have the ability to pay attention. And this is absolutely not true. As I mentioned before, lots of people with ADHD can hyperfocus and can really pay attention to something if they are engaged in it. Sometimes when those with ADHD are not particularly engaged in something, they might have difficulty in regulating their attention. And what we mean by that is focusing on the right things. So you might be easily distracted by other things that are going on around you, but actually you can't pay attention to the right thing and the important thing. So it doesn't mean that you can't pay attention, it just means that there's difficulties in that area sometimes in terms of paying attention to what's important. So we think a better description would be attention dysregulation, hyperactivity condition, and just getting rid of that word disorder there. There's also a connection between dopamine and ADHD. So dopamine is our reward-based neurotransmitter. So we get a dopamine hit, if you like, when we do something that we enjoy, when we do something that feels good, but it also gives us a sense of reward and accomplishment when we achieve things. And what that does is it motivates us to then go and seek out the next reward. Now, there's lots of research gone into this, but essentially there's a deficiency, or there can be a deficiency of dopamine in an ADHD brain. And what that means is lots of people with ADHD might not be motivated for long-term rewards because they're not getting that same dopamine hit as people without ADHD. Or they might be constantly seeking out that next reward all the time, which can lead to some things like impulsivity or the need for movement all the time, because one thing that does increase the flow of dopamine is physical activity and movement. Now, these are the three main types of ADHD. We've got predominantly hyperactive impulsive type, predominantly inattentive type, and combined type. Now, depending on where you are, these might have, you know, different names and things like that, but essentially these are the three main types of ADHD. But actually it's much bigger than this, and ADHD is very much a spectrum. So no two people with ADHD are going to present exactly the same, and we do see it as a spectrum condition. Now, executive functions is something that I mentioned earlier on in this presentation, and these are essentially the way our brain helps us to organize, but also there's inhibition there, so it helps us to regulate our emotions, helps us to regulate our responses to things as well. Now, these executive functions, there's 8 of them that I'm going to talk to you about in a second. They are housed here in what's called the prefrontal cortex. It sits at the front of our brain here. Now, lots of studies have shown that there can be a delayed development in this part of the brain for those with ADHD. So this is one of the reasons why we may see difficulties in these areas for lots of people with ADHD. So the 8 executive functions are, we've got impulse control, which I've already mentioned, emotional control, which I'm going to come back to in a second, flexible thinking, so being able to adapt things, you know, if things come up and things change, being able to adapt quickly. We've got working memory, which is a type of short-term memory. It allows us to store something temporarily in our heads until we can then get it down into another format, for example. So the best example I could give would be if you've got to remember something, it's something that you've got to do, but it's not written down anywhere, it's storing it in there until you can either get it done or write it down on a to-do list or something like that. Then we've got self-monitoring, which is all to do with self-awareness, planning and prioritizing, so having a plan for something and then being able to prioritize, so knowing what do you need to get done first, what's the most important first step, and so on. Task initiation, just getting started on things, can be a real challenge for lots of people. And then organization as well, and that can be external organization, so having everything physically ready that you need, but also internal organization, so organizing your thoughts and keeping track of things mentally. Now, what we might see in lots of people with ADHD, not everyone, but lots of people with ADHD may have difficulty in some, not necessarily all, but some of these areas. On that column on the right there, you can see each executive function, what it looks like when it's not working effectively. So I'd like you to take this opportunity to pause this video and have a little look at that column there and have a little think about your child and think, which of these areas do you think they might be having difficulty with? Are there any key executive functions that you might see they're definitely having issues in those areas? Now, everyone's different, of course, but some of the things that often come up with ADHD, but not for everyone, are things like impulse control, emotional control, working memory, and organization. But of course, those others can come up as well. So have a little think about which ones maybe impact your child more than others. Now, we also know that those with ADHD can have difficulties in regulating their emotions. Now, those of us who are neurodiverse are thought to be around a third behind with our emotional maturity. So 16-year-olds with ADHD may operate emotionally as if they were 11, or 14-year-olds may respond emotionally or operate emotionally as if they were 9. So there is a delay in terms of emotions. One of the reasons for this is the makeup of an ADHD brain. So we've got different parts of our brain that all have different functions. I'm going to focus on 2 here, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. So the limbic system often gets called our chimp brain in the book that you can see on screen there, and goes into that in a lot more detail. And this part of our brain reacts very emotionally to things, and it's there to protect us if we're in any danger. But this frontal part of our brain, as well as having those executive functions, one of the jobs that it does is that it helps to control that chimp brain. It helps to keep that limbic system in check, and it helps us to only respond emotionally to situations if it's appropriate. But we know that this part of the brain, there is a delayed development in some with ADHD. So we may see children with ADHD and young people with ADHD operating from that limbic system more often than those without. A great way of describing it is having your fist like this. So your thumb there, that's your chimp brain, and then this is your prefrontal cortex that sits nicely over the top. But when we sense danger, what happens is we say we flip our lid. So we stop using this part of our brain and we start using this part of our brain. And that's good for when we're in real danger. But when this is underdeveloped, as it is in many with ADHD, we're going to see them flipping their lid when there isn't any danger. So we're going to see big emotional responses to situations that maybe don't necessarily require that emotional response. There's also something called rejection sensitive dysphoria. And if you're interested, I would Google this and look a little bit more into it. Essentially, loads of people with ADHD can be more sensitive to rejection than those without ADHD. So if they get things wrong in school, they might take it to heart and they might take it really, really personally, even if it's just one wrong mark or somebody looks at them in a certain way, they might take things really, really personally. And you might recognize some of this in your children. And there's also a lot of feelings of isolation and difference that can come with these conditions. So these first two quotes here are from a study that was done interviewing adults with ADHD and how they felt through their lives. And those last two there are from kids that I've worked with in schools. And often what comes up is they just feel very different and they want to feel like everyone else. The last one there, he said to me, please can you cure me of my ADHD and can you get rid of it for me, because he just wanted to be like everyone else. And obviously this does have an impact on a person's emotional well-being. Now I'm just going to show you this quick video clip, which is basically a study that was done at the University of Central Florida. So we've got the same child here on the left and on the right. He was asked to read a set of instructions to then complete a task. On the left, the task was all about maths, and on the right, the task was all about Star Wars. So I'm just going to play this video and I just want you to compare the two of them side by side. So as you can see, the video on the left there, he's constantly moving, he doesn't really sit still at all. And on the right, he does a little bit of fidgeting, but he's sat pretty still for the majority of the time there, really. Now, what was really interesting about this video was that they then asked this child to then go and complete both tasks to see if he'd been paying attention to what he was reading. Now, most people would expect that he was able to do the Star Wars task and not able to do the math task, but actually he was able to do both. He was moving on the left because he wasn't interested in what he was reading. He was actually moving to keep his attention, not to distract himself. It was the opposite. He was moving to increase that dopamine flow so that he could pay attention. On the right, he already had that emotional reward, that dopamine hit. He was reading about something he enjoyed, so he didn't need to move as much. Now, this tells us two things about kids with ADHD, or this particular child, is one, if we can build engagement, it's going to be absolutely key. So my top tips, the first one is always about engaging with the child's interests. And when you're doing, homework with them and things like that, if there's any way of tapping into their particular interests, their hobbies, their likes, any way of trying to tap into some of that with their homework, it's going to build that engagement a little bit. But also talking to their school and talking to their teacher about this and telling their teacher what they like and asking if they can adapt some lessons to engage with their interests. Also, movement is key. We're also going to look at reducing distractions, supporting executive functions, and allowing time for emotional self-regulation, and then some ways that we can celebrate ADHD as well. So as I mentioned, movement is absolutely key. Now, many schools are using things like standing desks, which can really help. So, little wooden platform that you can put on top of a normal desk and they can work on top of. Ask the school if they have any resources like this, or a wobble cushion that they can sit on and move. If they're allowed any fidget resources, something just to kind of stimulate them while they're listening, it can really help to aid attention. Some other ideas there that schools have done, so time resistance bands around the chair, so that they can kick out and stretch their legs and things like that. Sometimes they take Velcro under the desk that they can fidget with. But I mention these for two reasons. Firstly, there's any way that we can adapt any of this in their workstations at home to enable them to complete any homework more effectively and allowing that movement, but also communicating with school and suggesting some of these ideas there as well. But also, one thing that really helps young people with ADHD is frequent movement breaks. So if we're asking them if they've got to sit and do homework for an hour at home, if we can build in little movement breaks along the way, so every 10 minutes, when you've done 10 minutes of work, you get a 5-minute movement break. What that does, firstly, it helps to increase some of those endorphins and that dopamine, which supports their well-being, but it also helps that need for movement and helps them to pay attention as well. So some ideas around movement there. Some ways of reducing distractions. If they have their own workstation that they can work on at home, just thinking about what's around. Are they too close to the window and going to be distracted by that? Is there too much clutter on the desk that maybe we need to get rid of? And thinking about making that space as private as possible and getting rid of any distractions. Sometimes listening to a bit of white noise, so just a constant sound, not necessarily music with words, but just a little bit of background music or the sound of rain. That you can find this all online, and things like that to help. Think about exactly where they're sat, as I've mentioned, and some of those distractions there as well. We've talked about taking breaks and chunking the learning up. If they're doing, homework, chunking it up into 10-minute blocks is really going to help. Praising them along the way helps to keep that dopamine flow and helps to keep them on task. And all of the research suggests that children with ADHD would much rather have a small reward now than a bigger reward later. So think about the rewards that we're giving them, and whether it's something that builds up to the end of the week. It's probably going to be more effective if it's a little token reward there in the moment, and it doesn't have to be something huge. It might just be an extra little break that they get from doing their homework, or 10 minutes on the iPad, or whatever it is. But just little instant rewards can really help to reduce some of those internal distractions and keep them focused on the tasks at hand. Then, in terms of supporting some of those executive functions, so the organisation and all of that sort of stuff, trying to externalise time. So lots of children with ADHD can struggle with the passing of time and can maybe spend a huge amount of time on something that doesn't require that much time. So using things like alarms and stand timers to help them keep track. So if you're doing 10-minute chunks on the homework, give them a stand timer for 10 minutes and turn it over. And this is something I'd suggest with the school as well, to talk to their teacher about, can they do this? Making to-do lists, so working through a to-do list with them. Okay, what is the homework you've got to do this week? Let's make a list. We'll break it down into smaller steps and tick it off along the way. Color coding things and their workstations, so the pen's always in the certain color drawer and all of that sort of stuff, just to help get them organized a little bit better. Allowing processing time, so if you're working with them on something, ask them a question, just give them that few extra seconds to organize their thoughts and allow them to process what you've asked them. Communicating with school, as I've mentioned throughout, is absolutely key. So anything you notice at home when they're working, any difficulties they might be having, and you notice something that really helps. So if you notice that doing a to-do list at home really helps them, you should be speaking to their teacher and saying this really helps them, they need to be using this in school as well. And asking school, it can work the other way around. Asking school what helps for them there, you can implement some of that at home. Having visual timetables so they can see, it's not just about work necessarily. Of a weekend, having a little timetable of what you're doing throughout the day so they can see what's coming up, they can help get themselves organized and prepared. And sticking to routine as much as possible is really going to help those with ADHD as well. Now, we've spoken a little bit about emotional regulation, and this emotional curve kind of sums it up best really in terms of what we often see for those with ADHD. So when we're at the bottom of this curve here, that's when we're calm and we're thinking rationally, but there's always some sort of trigger. So something happens to trigger some of those strong emotions. And what we want to try and do is, when they're at this point at the trigger, we can try and redirect them. We can try and distract them. We can try and put some support strategies in place to help them to calm down. That's the ideal, but obviously they're not always going to do that. Sometimes they reach the top, so they're not thinking rationally at all, a complete emotional breakdown. Now, the key message really is when they're at the top, they're not using the part of their brain that allows them to think rationally or logically about things. They're using the emotional part of their brain. So there's no point trying to talk to someone and reason with someone who's not using that part of their brain. We have to let them calm down, and then we can start discussing things. You know, discussing, you may well have to discuss consequences depending on what's happened, but it's much better to wait till they get to the bottom and they're thinking calmly again. But obviously there are things, as I mentioned, that we can do to try and stop it getting up there in the first place. So I would recommend checking out my colleague Emma Weaver's video. She's talking about ADHD in very little ones, but she talks a lot about this as well, and I would really recommend doing that, but helping them to recognize where they feel certain emotions, whether it's butterflies in the stomach, a headache, some people say they feel something here in the chest. Wherever they feel that frustration and that anxiety, once they can recognize that, they can start to put strategies in place. So sometimes having somewhere to go to be able to calm down can really help, like some of the examples you can see there. And sometimes relaxation strategies can help. Take 5 breathing just means you put your hand out like that, you trace around and you breathe in through your nose as you go up, out through your mouth as you go down, and you can just keep doing it until you feel calm again. Things like yoga and meditation can really help. There's some apps there that are great for meditation, and doing belly breathing as well. So one hand there, and you breathe in, and the hand that's on your stomach should be the one that's coming out, just to check that they're breathing effectively. But sometimes people need that deep pressure, more of a physical response, so weighted resources can really help. Resistance bands, you know, dumbbells, actual weights, or even making something homemade, so a load of books in a backpack and things like that, and they can walk around the garden with that on, if you've got one, and that can really help them as well. And we call that grounding, so really that deep pressure, bringing them into the moment, can sometimes help people as well. Using resources like this to kind of reflect what helps them and what doesn't. So I recommend having a Google of something called the Stress Bucket. You will see this activity online. It can be really, really helpful to try and help people understand what does help them and what doesn't help them when they do need it. Just going back as well before we finish to some of those positives that I've already mentioned, because the key thing, one of the huge things that we can do to support someone's well-being with ADHD is talk about ADHD in a positive way. And there are many, many positive role models, celebrities, successful people with ADHD. To name a few, American gymnast Simone Biles talks very openly about her ADHD. Swimmer Michael Phelps, Emma Watson, Harry Potter star, Michael Jordan. There's loads of people. If you just Google ADHD celebrities or just search ADHD celebrities, you will find absolutely loads who talk really openly about it and using them as role models as well. I've also put in the link to our website where you'll find loads more resources, including some of our comics which we've made, and that all the characters are neurodiverse. So one of them has ADHD and the rest have other conditions as well, but these can be really helpful for children and young people to help them to understand their condition a little bit better, which is one of the steps towards achieving that well-being with ADHD, is self-acceptance and self-understanding. So I do hope that you found this pre-recorded video useful. As I say, if you are after some more information, please visit our website where you will find loads of guides for children, for teenagers, and for parents as well, all tailored specifically for those audiences with more support strategies, some of which I've said today, but there's loads more that I haven't quite had time to mention, so please do check those out as well. Thank you very much.